This is BrainStem with your host, neuroscientist Dr. Hilary Marusak, production by Amanpreet and Manmeet Bogle. Dan, I am so excited to finally see you face to face, quote unquote. Nice to meet you. If you want to go ahead and just briefly introduce yourself.
Definitely. Nice to meet you too. Big fan of your work. So my name is Dan Zaya Joseph. I am running a little bit of a study on psychology, and we're going to talk about that. So I have an Instagram at Combat Psychology. And I'm currently in the military. I'm serving in the Army as a platoon leader, and I'm working on a master's at this moment in time, wrapping up in the next few months as I build out a thesis on what I call combat psychology, and starting a second master's, a clinical psychology master's next year. So for now, I'm a former entrepreneur in the genetic space, currently in the military as a platoon leader, up and coming psychologist in the making. So that's sort of the quick and dirty introduction to who I am.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And that's definitely how we met. I like how you plugged your Instagram already. He has an amazing Instagram, so definitely go follow him. We definitely share a lot of interest in terms of psychology and the brain and what you're calling combat psychology, which I love that phrase. So I want to get a little bit into your background because your background is also very interesting. And then we'll turn to talking about things like PTSD and trauma and some of your current work. So can you start by just giving us kind of a brief overview of how you got to your current place?
So I come from a background in cellular biology. I went to school at UC Santa Barbara and worked in all things like molecular bio. And so my background, I'm a huge science nerd, and I've always had a nose in the books since I was a little kid. And then currently, so I was working in biotech for quite a while, and a lot of my friends were in the military, and I just realized I was hitting my 30s, and I have just kind of been behind a desk and really sort of living a safe life. And I wanted to do something adventurous and outside of my comfort zone. So then I entered into the military. It's a quick contract, just a few years, about 3 years, 3.5 years. And I also I still love science. I'm a huge nerd. I've read over 300 to 500, well, I'd say about 400 books if you include audiobooks. So I've just really kind of like doubled down on being a nerd. But I love learning about people and interpersonal dynamics and group dynamics. And so that all started, I started seeing this common thread from cellular biology all the way through how the human brain works, how relationships work, and how stress and anxiety works, and then working with combat vets and hearing about them going to war. And of course, I've heard about PTSD, and I've met guys and gals who've been blown up and shot at. And I had this sincere appreciation for working with these folks, these heroes, in the flesh. And they would never call themselves heroes because that's just the day in and day out. But a lot of combat vets, and I started realizing, and with my hobbies and jiu-jitsu and hearing people talk about breath control and anxiety control, I started realizing, hey, this is all based on neurons in the brain. And these neurons, they house our soul, our conscience. And I started seeing the mind-body-spirit connection and how it all tied into pragmatic research. And, it speaks to what you do with functional MRIs and things that we can actually see. And so it's sort of a connection between Eastern and Western philosophies on the experiential aspect of being a human and the emotional feelings-based approach to life, because we're a feelings-based organism. But then my love for cellular biology and all things genetic. And I just saw this beautiful sort of like constellation, almost like a stained glass type expression of all the pieces that make us human. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to being good to one another, being stable within ourselves, inner validation, and just being present. And that's sort of this is how my brain works. I'm just always sort of like metacognitive. It's exhausting, absolutely exhausting, but I just love, meeting people like yourself who can stomach this sort of depth of a conversation, because it's so cool to have that everything's tied together. And as deep as we want to go into our human existence, either on the psychological side or on the microbiological side, I mean, it's just, we're just digging out more and more meaning in our existence and what it means to be human. And so that's just a sort of, yeah, the palette with which I paint.
No, that was perfect. I mean, these are hitting on major questions, some of the most, if not the most important question that we have. What makes us humans and how do we function and why do we do the things we do? So I think you're right, and neuroscience is so exciting in that respect. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's really the advances we've had in the technologies and the tools and the approaches and thinking about very diverse perspectives from other types of, disciplines and even things like philosophy has really allowed us to learn new things about the brain and about ourselves. So lots to talk about there in terms of
Yeah.
mind-body interventions. And I'm already pinching myself. We should have scheduled like a 3-hour interview, but I want to dig into trauma and PTSD, which is really the focus of this discussion. And people typically think about PTSD in the context of military veterans. And you are in the military, so you're very equipped to speak about those issues. But I think people don't often consider that trauma and PTSD can happen for other reasons, like being in a car accident or being in a domestic violence situation or childhood abuse, which is what I study in the lab. So, can you talk about just your view of trauma and PTSD?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll talk about this academically, and then I'll tell you about my personal story if that's cool to just might take a minute. So my experience with understanding the concept here is basically just the human body keeps, like as Dr. Vanderkolk wrote about, the body keeps the score, and so there's psychosomatic representation or flashbacks of emotional states from the past that the body has held on to. And speaking of the brain as sort of an algorithm, it, from what I understand, it neurologically creates an index file with a memory and an emotion. And when people don't grieve and they don't process the emotional state of something they suffered in the past, that data stays collected in the brain as these triggers coincide with this level of a fight, flight, freeze response. And so we experience, we re-experience the past trauma until we grieve it fully and process it fully and allow our brain to restore that memory as an event that occurred without having to have this massive sort of fear response or anxiety response. And so I work with people who, let's say we're working on the demo range doing explosives and whatnot, and we have a scheduled explosion that goes off. There's people with PTSD in the military who will all of a sudden they'll just shudder when they feel that blast hit because they remember, and this could be a distant explosion. They remember, say, a bomb going off overseas, and then what followed through was, later on that day they found out it killed someone they knew. And so you see, I've seen them actively, physically go through this, in the military. And we're not in a combat situation. I'm not in a post where we train people for combat, but we're not actively in combat. And I've actually heard verbatim from their mouths, "Hey, this environment, this scene right here, I'm back in Afghanistan. I'm back in Iraq." And so I'm sitting there looking at, at a colleague of mine, just feeling my heart being pulled. It's a heavy thing. You see that weight that they carry. And I remember one guy I was rolling with in jiu-jitsu had told me, "Hey, I was in a car accident a few months ago, so if I get really stiff and rigid on the mats, I'm sort of having flashback." And it was one of the coolest moments, one of the first times in my life I heard someone express, "Hey, I don't know how to stop this, but I will have a flashback potentially, and I just want you to know if my body's acting this way, this is what I'm experiencing." And I remember the power of him having that language to label that and externalize that. And that was so cool. And it was so inspiring for me to say, "Wow, you just own that. You absolutely own that." And so now that I'm studying psychology and wrapping up this master's program, I'm constantly looking back at all the interactions I've had throughout life that have sort of fed into this concept. And I personally have experienced some trauma in the past, and that has come out in jiu-jitsu. And I can definitely go into that if that's something to talk about now. But I don't mind sharing this. It has to do with child abuse. So I realized in jiu-jitsu there was a moment in my life where I was being the coach had mentioned that I was freezing. Essentially, he was asking me why I couldn't execute a certain type of move in jiu-jitsu. I had no idea why. And what had happened is my body was, in looking back now at the neurophysiology, what happened was flooding, and the freeze response. I was stuck in a freeze response. And later through therapy, I realized came to the revelation that this was a freeze response regarding my motor neurons, related to a re-experienced sort of vision or feeling from trauma as a child. I was having a flashback. And so on the mats in jiu-jitsu, my body was in a position and there's enough pressure in certain areas, and there's a feelings-based, expression of the art that we do in jiu-jitsu that was completely reminiscent of me as a child, first undergoing that abuse. And so what happened is I froze, I shut down, and then my brain started ruminating on thoughts, on a lot of dark memories, and a lot of I would say almost like a pre-verbal experience. Like I didn't have words to put it. It was just this all-encompassing sort of darkness, this shroud that came over me where it was the heaviest feeling in my life. And I kept going to jiu-jitsu, in fact, because I had no idea that it was happening from the mats. But all I knew was that was that one safe space where I could be around people and I could connect with others in a really cool way. Because I'm very kinesthetic. I love touch, and that's how it's just. I feel like I'm sort of a puppy in a pack. You know what I mean? It's just we roll together, and it's this family. But it was actually bringing up some crazy stuff, and I was reading all these books. I started delving into this more and more. I became obsessed with psychology at this point because I started Googling things, psychology today, and I started going to these different resources and started reading books and podcasts, and I just realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm experiencing this. This is what I'm going through. And it felt very life and death, and what happened as a child sort of programmed into my body that I would just go into the state of shutdown, because as a child, you can't fight an adult who's, abusing you. And so what happened is, as an adult in my 30s, late 20s, 30s, I was re-experiencing that. And so even though I have an adult body, I could fight back. My brain didn't know that. And that's what I learned was what PTSD does. There's different modalities to it, and there's a spectrum of physiological responses and whatnot. But this was a pretty heavy time in my life, and jiu-jitsu held up a very ugly mirror for me to look at and see the past and see things that no child should ever experience. And I needed to master that and figure out this was my epic journey for my life, was figuring out, as long as it took, what had happened, what had been programmed into my brain neurophysiologically, and what I could do to possibly combat that and regain that mastery of my motor response, of my body, of my breath, all of that. And so I realized, I would stop breathing. I would sort of bear down as a child taking, that abuse. And so I would re-experience that sort of anticipatory anxiety and stress, and it became with shame, became with guilt, became with just all the worst emotions. And feelings aren't good or bad; they're information. But I was overwhelmed because as a child I was overwhelmed. So here I am as an adult in front of my jiu-jitsu black belt instructor, and he's seeing something. He's seeing this grown man just freezing and being awkward. But in my brain, it was just this massive download of data, this massive influx of information of past, present, future, not really sure. Here's all this information, do something with it. It was overwhelming. It was absolutely overwhelming. And it's taken years to process through this, and it'll probably never end. But the rabbit hole always gets deeper. And I'm encouraged to find folks like you who understand this and do research, like hard scientific research on this stuff. And it's so validating to come across work like yours and, read something that pertains to my experience. And I want to give that gift to others. So that's sort of my mission now, is whatever, take the shame out of it, take the stigma out of it, and just call it what it is. None of us asked to be screwed up. None of us asked to go through this stuff. And why not just make a difference, instead of coming across something medicative that's healthy and then hiding it. I'd rather just let others know, hey, it's going to be the hardest journey of your life, but if you're willing to understand more, I can show you the resources I've come to, and we can do this together. So that's sort of the experience.
Yeah, that's a beautiful overview. And I love that end message of just talking about it and reducing stigma, which is so important. And experiences like you described from your childhood, I think people would be shocked to know it's actually very common to experience adversity in childhood or trauma. And I think for kids, like you hit on, it's particularly detrimental or bad because a lot of kids blame themselves. They don't understand what's happening to them. They can't verbalize it in the same way that adults can. And there is something about the brain when it's developing that's more sensitive to having these traumas leave a lasting impact, which you mentioned like you haven't fully unearthed this until decades later and went into adulthood really. And I love what you said early on about how the body keeps the score. I love that phrase. And it just, your description was so beautiful because it really hit on everything that the brain does too and how it keeps track of these experiences. The brain is basically a survival instrument. Like that is its goal, to keep you alive. And if something bad happens that's going to threaten your survival in any way, it's going to remember, sights, sounds, smells that are associated with that event. And I don't think people understand that. Like for people with PTSD, it could be any of those things that trigger that trauma, and your body and your brain switches into that fight or flight mode. And that brain is organizing the rest of the body. So you might not even know what's happening. Like you mentioned, you might freeze, your hands might get sweaty. You might notice your heart is beating very fast. Those are all different effects of PTSD. And then you also hit on some of the other dimensions, like the cognitive, parts of it where you might feel like, there's something you did to cause this, there's something wrong with me, feeling down, which people think of more like depression, but that's also a part of PTSD. Working with kids, they tend to avoid talking about what happened or going to places that remind them of what happened. That's also really common. So I just thought your description was really great, and I think it'll resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, thanks. It's definitely a heavy topic. It took a while to get to the point where I can talk about this and not go into it and it just be completely exhausting. There were times where even just scratching the surface of what I just disclosed to you would leave me, and it's so weird. I mean, I would have just vivid dreams or nightmares or flashbacks or whatever it was, and I would just wake up exhausted, just even thinking about what happened or allowing those feelings to come back. And that's why therapy is so key. To not, you want to expose people to their past trauma, but in bits and pieces that they can manage. You want to sort of give them that crumb trail where they can take whatever it is they can handle at that moment, give them that container, that emotional container, and then allow them to piece their past, to reintegrate. And it's a reintegrative process. And you reintegrate one, it's like a mosaic, one tile at a time. When things get shattered, you got to pick up those pieces carefully because they're sharp, and so yeah, the experience is super heavy, and it's just absolutely, it can be the most isolating feeling in the world when you don't talk about it. And a lot of abuse is shrouded with the what happens here stays here, or don't ever talk about this to anyone. There's just so much poison with that. And as we know, in the world of psychology, the only way to fix something is to express it, because it's getting it on the table to then be malleable, to be something with neuroplasticity. You can go re-engineer your thoughts about that. You can re-experience it and it's heavy, but then you can also reprocess it and realize that you don't have to internalize these things, you can externalize. But the whole point is you have to get it out on the table. You have to get it out there in front of someone. And I think that ties directly to our neurophysiology. I mean, we have the largest prefrontal cortex of any organism. We have a massive prefrontal cortex. And monkeys, primates, they don't have anything close to what we have. So we're able to take these thoughts and these experiences and put objectivity there, where subjectivity was once just ruining us, thinking like, I did this, I did something wrong, or I'm weak, or this is embarrassing, this is shameful, I can never tell anybody this stuff. To then allow, separate the amygdala, the survivalistic part of the brain, and say, look, I get it, brain, like you had said, it's trying to keep us alive. To say, look, I understand you're looking for the tiger in the forest, or the snake, or whatever it is that's about to kill me or hurt me. But I understand now. This is not happening currently. And that's when the prefrontal cortex can come on, the anterior cingulate, all these parts of the brain where we maintain time and space. We can say, I'm in a safe place now. I'm at a safe time now. Let me allow these memories to surface. Let me honor the memory of what happened, but then teach myself. And this does not happen in a vacuum. We need other people. We're hurt socially, we heal socially, And so to allow someone into that space and say, look, I'm going to help you process this stuff. And that takes a massive amount of trust to allow somebody in, to not make fun, to not shame someone, to not turn their back, And so that's the whole part of, to me, of psychology is another human. Not that we're all fixed. Nobody's fixed. I mean, we know psychologists, we heal from the craziness that we've experienced. And it's how we know so much. We've mapped so much terrain just being who we are. But to meet another person and say, look, I'm here for you. I'm not hurting the same way you're hurting in this capacity. I hurt somewhere else. But for now, let me sit in this with you and lay it all out. It's not too heavy for me. Just drop it and let's piece it together. That to me is so cool. Yeah, there's an hourly rate associated with that. And I understand that some people, and I used to think like, well, I'm paying this person to help me. But at the end of the day, it's such a deep connection. It's a process that it's not about marketing it. It's not about selling it. This is a gift where, and that's something I wrestle with, is I want people to have these resources. There's books out there. There's so much free information. And it's all about learning how to face, darkness in our lives and bring a light into that and then shine that light for other people. And so that's a part where I'm at right now, is just wanting to just put that information out there and then see what I can build, see what clinic or what service is. But it's more so about, hey, are you hurting? Can I help you not hurt and not hurt yourself? People perpetuate that pain. The self-abuse, and we could talk about that. People will just self-sabotage. People just tell themselves, I deserve this forever. I deserve this. One relationship after the next. Whether it's employers or roommates or spouses or whatever it is, they just pick people that are bad for them. And just letting people know, like, hey, you deserve good things, and to just create that chain reaction where someone heals and then they want to help someone else heal. We create like just a social impact in that regard.
Yeah, I love the work that you're doing to communicate all of this too, because you're not only shedding light onto this area where, people need to talk about this more, but also you're giving them a light at the end of the tunnel, which you're totally right. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. There are things that you can do to rewire those brain circuits that science is, showing that it works and how it works, and also coming up with better ways to do it, like cognitive behavioral therapy. But also there are novel approaches where we can actually take that, I forget what you called it, index card of that memory out of your brain, reframe it a little bit before you plop it back in there. And that's what things like therapy do. They give you that ability to actually reframe it, because we can actually change memories. Memories are very malleable, which is something people don't totally understand. I love what you mentioned also about rolling with the one guy, and he had words to talk about how this might trigger his car accident. And it does get into what you were discussing about people are talking about this more. There's more, resources, which is a big contrast to even 5 to 10 years ago when people were not talking about PTSD. Now I think it's made its way, luckily, into kind of the lay audience and people understand what that means. But I think it hits on stigma as well. And I know you wanted to talk about stigma in different cultural contexts. So what are your views on stigma? How can we address this?
Well, yeah, speaking of culture, and I totally forgot about one of the biggest stories of PTSD in my life. So I'm Middle Eastern. My parents are from Iraq. My father actually passed away this year, but he, it's still close to my heart, and he's proud of a lot of the stuff that I was doing in this regard. So it's really cool working on this, just growing and giving this gift to others. But my parents, they experienced a lot of trauma. My mom, especially as a woman over there, we've seen with Afghanistan and the refugees and whatnot, what's happening. A lot of times women could be objectified by certain communities, and especially if they're of a different ethnicity and whatnot, they could be targeted extra violently. And that's what happened to my mother. One of her best friends was dragged away in the middle of the night. They came hunting for her. They found that she was trying to leave the country, and God knows what happened to her. My mother was also chased down, but she narrowly escaped twice, that I know of. I know it's very difficult for her to talk about this stuff. But I've asked her, because I believe that there's intergenerational PTSD as well. I believe that this is something where, when a mother has the baby on her breast and the baby's synchronizing with the breath pattern and the heartbeat and all of that, that the mother's basal anxiety rate is going to translate to the baby's, and the baby might not have words for it, but the baby's going to feel that. And so I believe that there's a lot of trauma that my parents both experienced that they weren't able to seek therapy for. They didn't even know, they weren't educated in that capacity. And so how could they know, right? And so as children, we've experienced that. We've seen things where they wake up in the middle of the night screaming, or certain things will just absolutely drive fear into them. Things with like ISIS happening overseas, while I have buddies who are, Navy SEALs and just complete badasses doing stuff like that, fighting the bad guys. My parents are sitting there watching the news thinking, oh my gosh, we escaped this, and this is coming back to haunt us, it's just terrible stuff. And with that culture, the cultural sort of stigma, a lot of these women will commit suicide after they're raped. They'll kill themselves because they feel that they are broken beyond repair. And the culture has a lot of what I've noticed is shame-based ideologies, whereas Western cultures tend to be more guilt-based, like Lex is Rex, laws king. And I think this had to do a lot with the sort of like the ancient Greeks and ancient Rome, and there's a sort of a divergence in which there's Eastern philosophies and Western. And so with the Eastern, it's a lot more shame-based. And so there's a lot of family honor talks, right? There's people who commit suicide for the sake of the family, who kill themselves if they dishonor the family, or being ostracized, basically, and kicked out of the family for being different. And so me coming from that culture, I realize how there's a fear, there's a desire to hide shame. And in psychology, we have to bring it out. We have to remove the mask. We have to see it there and allow it to be exposed, and not bring shame into it, not make anything taboo, but say, look, we've got to discuss this. This needs to be talked about in order for us to gain mastery over it. And so I personally have driven a lot of family members crazy because I asked them, please, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I feel it. I'm hypersensitive. I understand that. I grew up crying a lot as a little kid. I still tear up in movies. Like I can't be ashamed of this stuff. I used to be. I used to be really ashamed of it, and now I'm realizing that's a superpower. And so I'm trying to teach my family, like, look, guys, we literally can't afford. We cannot afford to live our lives shaming ourselves or shaming others for delving into this stuff and getting it out there on the table. And it's been difficult. I am now that guy who shows up and I tell family, you got to see a therapist. You got to see a counselor. This is not, you shouldn't have to carry this burden on you. And they fight it. There are relatives who absolutely despise that. And I'm never going to stop. I don't say it in a condescending way. I'm not trying to make them feel bad, but I lovingly want to let them know, whatever it is you're carrying, you don't have to carry that. And that's just on my heart. I hate seeing people live out these patternistic behaviors and these compensatory behaviors, maladaptive behaviors where they self-medicate in the wrong ways because they're I heard John Bradshaw used to say that alcoholics are trying to put a fire out, so they run into the ocean and drown themselves. That's what alcoholism is. And so you see people self-medicate, they're killing themselves self-medicating and running away from trauma. And there's a lot of, especially with masculinity or whatever it is in the Eastern cultures, that it's ironic because we have some of the strongest women in our cultures. Like, the women run the house essentially. If you ever see Big Fat Greek Wedding, that's exactly what it is. The man is the head of the house, the woman's the neck. She turns the man wherever she wants him to go, and that's so true. The women, we have amazingly strong women in our family. And honestly, much more than men. They at least speak their mind. The men will stay quiet. The women will say what's out there. They'll get it off their chest. They will fight. They will yell. They will hate. You're going to see me now that we're going to be present, right? And the men, I want to encourage them to speak with that same honesty and that truth, and to not think that, oh, I'm a man, so I have to bury this and hide it, or I'm part of this culture and I have to hide it. And we all know that men are much more prone to suicide than women are, and women also outlive men by 10 years, 8 to 10 years. And so there's the obvious weight of our physiology carrying shame or guilt or fear and living in that. And so my biggest goal is to speak back to my culture and let them know. I mean, at some point, I imagine I'm going to go overseas and maybe even go back to the villages where my parents are from and just want to educate people. Not force anything down anyone's throat, but just simply present them information and let them teach themselves. Let people learn about, hey, there's a thread here to tug at and see what unravels. What paradigms need to be shifted. But I personally really struggle with this with my family because my dad used to tell me, he used to say that I'm not really sort of like one of his people. He's like, you're American. You grew up in the U.S. You're more American than you are Middle Eastern. And my dad, I told him, negotiating with him was rough. It was really rough, And but before he passed away, we did really see eye to eye. It took his death, his dying process, to reach this vulnerable state. It took him a lot to let that, and even the nurses acknowledged in the hospital, like, hey, he doesn't want to tell us the symptoms because we're women, and Middle Eastern men like him, they don't want to share this stuff. It's shameful for him, and so he would tell me what was going on, some intimate symptoms of what he was going through, and I would let them know, hey, this is what my dad needs medication for, and they it was just hard because he had to keep that wall up. He was trained, he was raised in that capacity. And I love him. It took me a while though. I fought him a lot. My dad, if you don't speak about this stuff, you're not going to get help. And so, yeah, now I have that sort of that conviction in my heart that I need to be gentle the way that I do it, a gentle, tough love approach. But there is a subset of people, both in the Eastern communities of this world and then also in the male culture as well, where they're far more prone to self-harm and suicide. And that's so sad, especially war heroes, with vets. The enemies didn't kill them; they're killing themselves. Like, that is so just. It hurts to even conceptualize that. That's very. Yeah, it's heavy, but that's my mission, and I'm not going to fear, but I'm going to go in there brave, and it's going to be a fight, and people are going to fight back, and ignorance is going to be out there. Ignorance is very loud, but when you love something, it's not work. It's passion and it's love, and that's how I feel about the whole world of psychology.
That is so clear, and I cannot wait to see what you do. You mentioned jujitsu. I know you're a huge fan of that. You mentioned mind-body interventions, and that's actually how we kind of crossed paths on Instagram. I think, posted something about our recent martial arts paper for dealing with pain and distress in kids with cancer. And I work with kids. You work a lot with adults. There's a huge interest in mind-body interventions, and actually a huge body of research now that's really, taking the rigorous scientific approaches to understand if these things actually work and how they work. And what people are finding is that they work in most cases far better than a lot of drugs that we have. And they're a lot more accessible for folks. So I think there's a lot of benefits here. Obviously, it's not, a cure-all. If you consult with a psychiatrist, you do want to look at a medication approach too, if that's what's best for you. So I'm not discounting drugs, but I think for a lot of people, these interventions are really helpful, and they can be, complementary to other types of treatment approaches. The National Institutes of Health actually has a whole institute dedicated to this complementary medicine approach, is what they're calling it. So I think we'll see more in this area as, research begins to pick up a little bit more. But tell us about jiu-jitsu. Tell us what it has done for you, dealing with trauma and some of those PTSD symptoms.
Well, I will say that jiu-jitsu, the mats don't lie. And if someone is a bully, they're going to be a bully on the mats. If someone is fearful or timid or angry or upset, it comes out on the mats. This is a direct representation of your emotional state. It comes out in the tension, how hard you grip somebody, how hard you pull or fight. And the more you fight, the less technique you have. Technique it's a beautiful thing. When you roll with a black belt and they grab you, they touch you like it's like water on your body. It's just simple. It's a flow state. They're not compensating for anything because they have all the technique. You go against somebody who's fearful, they will be very rigid. They will grab you and they will hold you, and they will, this is coming from somebody who used to do that, right? And so in jiu-jitsu, there's a psychosomatic representation of who you are that comes out on the mats. And whatever feeling state you have, it's going to come out. It's pretty common knowledge that when you roll, let's say your buddy's going through a divorce and they got into a particular fight that week. This has happened with a friend of mine. We would all know because this person would come in a little more angry than usual, a little more rigid than usual. And it got to a point where it's like a family, it's a group, it's like a tribe. We would talk one-on-one. Hey, what's going on? Are you doing okay? Like, I feel your body's off. Like, something's up. You're tense. You're doing things a little different. And that's such a cool thing where talk about intimacy, and that's male intimacy right there. And I know that word gets a lot of mismarketing and whatnot. We can talk about that later, but that's where you can ask somebody, like, hold them accountable. Hey, what's going on? I'm here for you. And so jiu-jitsu offers that. There's different layers. You can go really deep in that and have that community. The attrition rate's pretty high. People leave. A lot of people leave after 1 year because it's such a blow to the ego getting choked out. But if the people stay with the sport, then you just go deeper and deeper with these people, and it becomes medicated. It is medicine. To me, it's one of the healthiest addictions I can hope to have. And it's just man. I've had to ask people. I mean, this got to a point with me where I have a freeze response on the mats, knowing what I know about my past and PTSD or whatever it is, the trauma. It's just so. Yeah, it was so heavy. Anyway, I would have a freeze response, and I would ask my friend. I would let my friend know, hey, it's gonna get weird. I'm about to be weird. I'm gonna freeze. I'm gonna not know what's going on. I'm gonna kind of glaze over. My breath's gonna be off. But feel free to help. However, or stop. We could stop for a while. I didn't know. It was such an awkward ask. Got to a point where my friend would put his chest on top of mine and tell me to breathe with him, and then we'd regain the match and start rolling. That was one of the craziest, intimate moments of my life, for somebody to literally say, hey, breathe with me, follow my breath, and then I'd come into the present, and then we continue to roll. That was one of the most healing properties of jiu-jitsu. And no way, come on, a therapist can't do that. That's illegal. Where can we create a world where you have this very primal connection? And that's what's so cool about jiu-jitsu is this balance between the primal brain and a very technical prefrontal cortex. And you're getting both to light up in a sequential order simultaneously in this antagonistic and yet synergistic approach. Because you need both. You need, when someone's grabbing you on a blood choke, carotid artery in your jugular, and you could die within 7 to 30 seconds of them compressing it. But then you also have to light up, so that's the fight or flight response, the brainstem, the amygdala, everything's going crazy on that. I'm going to die. But then the prefrontal cortex fires on, wait a minute, this is familiar. I know that if I turn my body this way, boom, I'm out of it. And now we're back in the world. And so it's this beautiful place where it could be violent, but it's a soft violence. It's not aggressive. It could be if you're competing and whatnot. But what I'm saying is there's no striking force. There's no punches and kicks. It's this flow state. And it's a flow with the brain on all parts just working together. And so the body is definitely going to bring up anything you have going on. Feelings will come out and you can process it there. But you don't have to get up and run away. And a lot of people do. I used to do that. A lot of people will get overly flooded and say, yeah, I'm going to go get a drink of water and then not come back. Because how it's so almost embarrassing to express this vulnerability, and that's why I love Brene Brown and all the work she's doing about vulnerability. To let people know, hey, there's got to be someone you can talk to about this. You can't just run away from this because it's going to chase you the rest of your life. And on the mats, that's, again, I've heard a black belt say the mats don't lie. If say they're worried about someone being a mat bully, so hurting someone, they'll see if they do, maybe they made a mistake, right? But if they do it to 2, 3 people, at that point they come in and they green light the person and say, look, you either stop this behavior or you're leaving this gym, or we will hurt you for hurting other people. It's a primal world, but it's this place where, and they might not even be aware. There are a lot of people who say, I genuinely did not know that I was gripping that hard or using that much force. And, who knows what they experienced in their past, right? And so that's another, they have this moment. You either learn here and you're willing to be taught and mentored with all these upper bellmen keeping their eyes on you, or, that behavior is just, it's got to be resolved in some way. And, again, the attrition rate is very high within 12 months to 24 months of jiu-jitsu because people, it doesn't matter where you're, how good you are in life anywhere else, you're going to get submitted and you have to get tapped out for months, like 6 months of just like, oh, tap, 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 tap. I can't do anything. You're just putty in this person's hands. It's a cat and mouse game. And that really checks the ego. But it helps to soften the ego in a lot of ways. And it creates somebody who then off the mats is thinking in traffic, do I want to honk and flip this guy off, or do I just want to say, you know what? I'm going to tap out. Go ahead. If you're in that much in distress, take the blame. I'm not going to fight. I mean, it becomes this philosophical approach to life of, especially as you become an upper belt, and not that I am now, I'm still a white belt. But as you progress through life, you realize you never want to hurt someone, even if especially if you have the power to hurt. These black belts are never going to hurt someone unless they deserve to be reprimanded in a way for violent behavior themselves. These upper bellmen will never go out of their way to harm someone because it's so easy for them to do that. And I love that philosophy. Again, it's that gentle family feeling of, hey, we're here to push each other, but within reason and with intelligence and with emotional balance. And that goes back to the Eastern philosophies of life. And I can go for the days. Sorry.
Yeah, and besides like the social connection and the community aspects, I think a lot of what you hit on too is really getting into mindfulness. And I need to do an episode on mindfulness at some point, but a lot of the things you mentioned that are inherent to jiu-jitsu are also common in things like yoga or martial arts, other types of martial arts, and even meditation. So things like just realizing you're having an emotional reaction, realizing that this is, happening to you, your body is responding in some way. And also the ability to actually take control of your emotions with things like breathing and just having that tool and realizing that you do have, power to not only recognize your emotional response, but actually do something about it, which is really, really cool for people, especially people suffering from emotional disorders like PTSD. So I think those are really cool aspects of the so-called mind-body interventions, and they each have kind of their own, additional things. Like Jiu-Jitsu does sound like it has some things that are very unique to that approach, but I think it's probably one of the things where it's like, try a couple different things, see what fits best for you. And I guess along those lines, to end, besides trying Jiu-Jitsu, what would you recommend for someone who is struggling with PTSD or with trauma? And what would you say to those folks?
So I would say the biggest thing, the internet's going to be a huge resource for you. Of course, you have to be careful about where you're getting information from, but look at what people have published. Look at the research. Normalize your experience by going on YouTube and having people in TED Talks and whatnot from acclaimed resources, of information, peer reviewed. Have them share their story and see what's similar to you. And don't ever feel like you have to agree with any piece of information if it's not true to you. But when you feel that aha state of, okay, this is something that resonates with me, feel free to go down that rabbit hole. And man, I would say definitely mindfulness and the meditative approach is key to sort of turn down the background noise and to start thinking as objectively as possible. And just be honest with yourself. I would say if anybody knows that they've struggled through PTSD and they know they've been traumatized, it's difficult to put words to this. Even for me now, it's hard to say that. It's almost like I don't deserve to carry that label. That's for people who've gone through much worse than I have. I mean, it's such an interesting, approach to that or thought. But I would say understand that you want to question your own thought processes. You want objectivity. That's so you got to humble your pride and ego defenses and fear responses, and be aware that they're there. And don't shame yourself for having them, but understand that the lens through which you see the world may be a little bit dirty. And find people and find mentors and find resources that help you see things from a slightly different angle or a slightly clearer perspective than you have. And with each story that you read and each experience that someone else has had, especially these books that are out there. There's so many books where they have stories that are so reminiscent of things that we've all experienced. But as you see these and read them, you feel validated. You realize, like, oh my gosh, I've experienced exactly that. And then again, you keep pursuing these areas in your life. So it's almost like a self-guided journey. and it's your journey, but it's something that you know, once you do it, it's going to be the hardest thing you're ever going to do. It really is, but it's also the most rewarding. And to not take that lightly, to always look back at who you used to be and know where you're going, and be proud of that. Be proud of the progress you're making, but pursue those resources. So I would say definitely for me, as I told you, I mean, 400 to 500 books in, I'm a massive unapologetic nerd. And most that's very atypical. But that's because the level that I wanted to heal, and I just couldn't stop consuming these books and whatnot. But pursue what it is that brings you peace, you know, that creates that inner calm. And then from there, find your inner validation. Uh, it's normal to look externally. Social media, how we look, you know, society really, really applauds narcissism and all of these different aspects of feigning that we're healed and we're centered and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, when you put your head on a pillow, ask yourself who you want to be, and then be very thoughtful about where you're going, what you're looking at, especially on the internet. There's so much distraction, there's so much background noise, but I have a policy for myself that for like a month, I would never use like a main website like that has a news feed. I would only go to the blank Google page, and I'd have to think for several minutes, what exactly am I looking for? Because I became hypersensitive to all this just information. And if you want to heal from trauma and you want to heal from the past of confusion and emotion and all that, you want to be very selective of who you let speak into your life and the thoughts that you think. And so I know I'm rambling right now, but it's just this is such a holistic approach to processing the past and using things like jiu-jitsu and sports and yoga, like you were saying, art, expression, whatever it is, being part of a small group. Find those things that work for you. There is no one size fits all. That's just as in there's no one type of trauma. There's no one type of woundedness. Find what matches your personality type, what works with your brain, what will help you be neuroplastic. Find those avenues and delve into that. And I can't give, this is why therapy is so great, because you can actively dialogue with someone that can see you and validate you in that moment, and all of your idiosyncrasies, all of your personality traits, everything that makes you unique, that's there for you to talk about. It is not a one size fits all approach. So have fun with it. It's a heavy journey, but enjoy yourself, enjoy the growth, and find things in this life that you find enjoyable, but that also have the element of healing. I don't know what else to say other than that. I don't know how complicated that answer was. It was not a clean answer, but that's what I realized for me. So.
I'm over here giving you a round of applause. That was beautiful. Listen, Dan, this has been so wonderful, and keep up the amazing work that you're doing. And like I said earlier, I'm really excited to see where you go with this. You have a really important message and a great gift in communicating that. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your background and all of your thoughts.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.